In this unit, we will begin to explore the very important aspect of protecting human subjects in research and specifically understanding the institutional review board that provides oversight for research that utilizes human subjects. The objectives for this module include a brief overview of the background of protection of human subjects, 3 very specific principles of protection of human subjects, as well as the levels of review that comprise institutional review board for studies that are carried out involving human subjects. First, I think it's important that we consider why would humans need protection when participating in research activities. I think we would all like to think that researchers have ethical practices, have taken care to minimize the risk for their study participants, and would not do anything harmful to their particular participants of research. We know historically this really hasn't been true. Much of the policy that we follow today actually comes out of really atrocious things that happened under the auspices of medical research that have occurred across time. Some very particular ones were abuses that occurred against humans during World War II that were conducted in Nazi Germany and were conducted with people who were in concentration camps. So obviously the people were not willing participants in what was called research, and I think today we would even question as to whether some of the things that took place were actual research activities or not. For instance, many of the activities, which all were conducted by German Nazi military physicians, included things that we would probably consider analogous to torture today. This included things like freezing experiments where people were exposed to extreme temperatures to see the effects of hypothermia, so they better knew how to apply that to their military troops. It also included the mass sterilization of over 3.5 million German citizens, and this was done to people who were deemed racially or genetically undesirable, so people of different races, people who were homosexual, people who were disabled. And so obviously all of this was done without the consent of the people participating. And all of this led to what's called the Nuremberg Code of 1947. So, so legally, the things that we follow now, including things like informed consent, the scientific process that has to be demonstrated as part of any study, and the requirement to reduce risk to our participants, really came out of the atrocities that occurred during World War II under the guise of research and medical research. The other well-known case, and you've probably heard of these things in your other courses in your undergrad studies, but another very well-known situation that involved non-protection of human participants in research were the syphilis studies that occurred in Alabama. And these were conducted by the U.S. Department of Public Health, the U.S. Public Health Service, from 1932 to 1972. And they recruited participants of African American males in Macon County in Tuskegee, Alabama. They recruited 600 participants. Most of these were sharecropper farmers, so they perhaps were attracted by what was being offered to participate in the studies. They were offered medical care, they were offered meals, and a burial insurance policy if they agreed to participate. So they recruited 600 participants. 399 tested positive for syphilis, and the purpose of the study was to investigate the natural progression of untreated syphilis. So they also recruited 201 people who did not have syphilis, and those served as their controls. The big ethical issues of this study were several things. First, the men who tested positive for syphilis were not informed that they had syphilis. And then, even more importantly, penicillin became the standard of care for treatment and effective treatment of syphilis in 1947. So the men were allowed to continue in the study from 1947 until 1972 without treatment. So public health service physicians and other researchers could document the progress of untreated syphilis. The study was ended, interestingly, in 1972 when a journalist found out what was occurring and then exposed the study through the media, through the Associated Press. The journalist's name is Jean Heller, and she actually is still alive and writes still in Florida. So these are just some examples of some very significant historical issues that have occurred that have resulted in in the need and many of the policies that we follow today for the protection of human subjects in research. As a result of these things, we began to see other types of policy and other types of legislation occur. So just to give you a perspective of this, the 1974 National Research Act was established, and that is what established institutional review boards, or IRBs, that were required to review all federally funded research. As we will learn, that extends to any type of research that's conducted at any particular institution, but IRBs were established by this act in 1974. In 1979, the Belmont Report was released, and this is really what provides the ethical framework for protecting human subjects who are involved in research. They make the very important distinction between research and practice and address the concepts of respect and justice, equity in research, and beneficence. So again, this really came out of the desire to regulate federally funded research that involved human subjects, that there would be some oversight protection, and that was done through what's called institutional review boards. But as we'll learn as we go along today, IRB approval and oversight applies to any research that's conducted under the umbrella of an institution, regardless as to whether it's federally funded or even externally funded. So it's important that we understand the application of protection. And so the research that we're talking about is all research that involves human subjects. So if the research does not involve human subjects, there's a different approval process for that. If research involves perhaps animal subjects, there is a parallel oversight organization that addresses protection of animals in research. But what we're particularly talking about is research that involves human subjects and requires the participation of human subjects in our research. It's important that we understand the risk to participants, and we're able to articulate that and express that so the person is informed of what they are participating in, and the understanding that an oversight review is required, that there has to be an oversight process. So if you're a researcher or working on research that is associated with a university or a large healthcare system, these institutions will have what are called IRBs, or their institutional review boards. If you perhaps are doing applied clinical research, maybe at a hospital, but there's not an IRB, oftentimes then the oversight review comes from perhaps a research committee within the facility or the institution, or an ethics committee. But the important point to take away here is that anyone conducting research really needs to have some sort of review and approval from an oversight review process. It's important for the protection of the subjects, but it's also important for the protection of the researcher as well. So for people who maybe are interested in clinical research and they're not in a facility that has that particular mechanism for oversight review, then oftentimes what they do is then they align themselves perhaps with a university department, and then that way they're able to take advantage of the institutional review board of that institution that will provide that oversight review process, and they have that documentation that research protocol has been vetted by someone, and they have indeed taken the necessary precautions, and they are ethically conducting research that is involving human subjects. Now we're going to spend a little bit of time exploring three principles that really serve as the foundation for the protection of human subjects, and we'll consider each one of these individually. So the first is full disclosure, the second is informed consent, and the third is confidentiality. Full disclosure to participants says that we have the responsibility to disclose to the participants what it is that they're agreeing to participate in with regard to the research. So we have to be able to articulate and provide to them the purpose of the research. We have to be able to explain to them the length of time required for participation in the research so they understand what their commitment is. So this might be the duration of the study, but also their amount of time. So if you're doing a study perhaps where you're looking at some particular type of OT intervention, and the intervention is going to be delivered twice a week for 4 weeks, then that's what needs to be explained as far as how much time the intervention sessions will last and how many weeks the participation is required. Very importantly, we have to be able to articulate the risks in participating and communicate that with the participants. So this might include any adverse effects they may sustain as a result of participation. These could be very minor things to more severe things, but we want to try and think of any anticipated events that can occur so that the person is able to understand the potential risks in participating in the study, but then still agree to do so if that's what they choose to do. Conversely, we also want to be able to discuss the benefits of participating. Sometimes it may not seem that there is any direct benefit of participating, but sometimes people may get additional information, they may get additional medical care or medical testing or diagnostics. Perhaps medications or treatment might be covered. It just depends on how the study is funded and how that is set up. So it's important that we're able, again, to identify, articulate, and then communicate the benefits of participating in the study. Now, it's important that all of this be disclosed to the participant in some form of documentation. So, most studies will require some sort of information sheet that is either given to the participants or they go through a process of informed consent, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes, that documents the issues that we just talked about and requires their signature saying that they understand and are agreeing to participate in the study. So, this addresses our requirement or a researcher's responsibility to disclose to the participants all of the aspects about the study. The second principle of protection is that of confidentiality. And this is very important to research participants because the researcher needs to be able to ensure that all information obtained from the participants will be maintained confidentially. So it's important to specify who has access to the data, how will data be collected, how will data be de-identified so that you separate the name or any potential identity from the person from the research data, how will files be protected, how will they be stored, and then ultimately when findings are reported, how is confidentiality maintained for those participants as well. Now notice we use the word confidentiality. Sometimes people want to go as far as using the word anonymity, thinking that that is a higher level of protection, but the reality is it's very hard to have anonymous participation in a research except perhaps maybe in a survey that's mailed out and the person returns to you so you never have any identification on the data materials. Any other type of research really means that someone in the study knows who that person is. So therefore the word confidentiality is used, and we take great care in separating how we identify those participants in the study. It's often done through coding, and data sheets are then by coded participants rather than any name. And so people who are processing the data or analyzing the data then will truly not have the identity of the person there, but at least one person and typically several people involved with the research plan and data collection do know who the identity of the person is, and procedures are put in place so that the identity of the person is protected through confidentiality. So confidentiality is the second principle of protection of human subjects. The third principle, which again comes out of the Nuremberg Code of 1947, is that of informed consent. And this is the process by which participants are informed of the study and the participation requirements. So it's a combination of full disclosure, and the information must be disclosed to the person, but then the information is given to the person in a document that they can review and then perhaps sign. So it's very important that this be communicated in lay terms, that it not be filled with technical jargon or acronyms or clinical terms that a person who doesn't have a clinical background cannot be reasonably expected to understand and comprehend. So informed consent includes things such as the purpose of the study or the purpose statement, the description of study procedures. So what will the person be required to do every time they come in for a session or for an intervention or for testing, disclosure of all the other things we talked about, the risks and the benefits. So everything that's part of full disclosure is presented in the informed consent. How do we maintain confidentiality, not only of their participation in their study, but how do we protect their patient information? It's also very important that it be documented that it is voluntary to participate in any study, that their participation or desire not to participate will not adversely affect their availability for services or treatment otherwise, and that they may withdraw from the study without any explanation and without being questioned as to their reason for withdrawing for the study. So that's extremely important, and how we handle informed consent then becomes very important, because let's say, for instance, you are the lead therapist who's investigating a clinical study for people with carpal tunnel syndrome, and you need to have informed consent. The patient knows that you are the person who is in charge of that study, so they may feel perhaps not through anything you say or do, but just that power inequity that we've discussed in other situations before. They may feel somewhat compelled to participate in the study because they feel that if they don't, then they may not receive the therapy or the services that they actually were referred to in which they're coming to the clinic. So oftentimes it's important that the issue of informed consent be handled with someone who's entirely outside of that clinical aspect. So it could be someone else in the facility. It could be an administrator, so that the person then feels free to ask questions, and it can be very clearly explained to the person that their participation in that study is voluntary. It in no way affects any other care or treatment that they are entitled to receive, and that they may also withdraw their participation at any point without any explanation needing to be provided. The other aspect of informed consent is, of course, providing contact information. Who is the principal investigator of the study? Who is the person that they can contact if they have any questions, concerns, or issues they would like to discuss? So again, 3 principles of protection of human subjects include full disclosure, confidentiality, and informed consent. Now, it's important that we understand the structure of an institutional review board or an IRB. For instance, here at the Health Science Center, our IRB staff actually resides on our floor in the building here on the second floor. So you often see their signs on our floor. So every institution will have an IRB staff, and these are people who are extremely highly trained in compliance and regulatory issues related to research and funding and protection of human subjects. Then, in addition to the IRB staff personnel, you will have an institutional review board, and the board consists of a variety of members who typically volunteer their time, and they come from across the institution as well as from outside of the institution. So here at the Health Science Center, IRB boards are made up from people across all of the schools and a variety of departments within the university. There are scientific members, non-scientific members, as well as outside people who serve as community members on the board. So they have a wide variety of background, a wide variety of things to contribute to the board, and they are the ones who are responsible for reviewing all study protocols that are submitted to the IRB that require IRB approval. So for instance, because the Health Science Center is a large institution that conducts a lot of research that requires review, we actually have 3 continually ongoing IRB review boards. And so each one consists of approximately 20 to 25 members. Each board meets every 6 weeks to review the protocols that they have been assigned. And so there's one board who typically is meeting about every 2 weeks. The meetings are held here on campus. You as students are certainly able to come visit an IRB meeting. They're very interesting, and just to understand that review process, I have had the privilege of serving on one of the boards for about 3 or 4 years and have learned a tremendous amount, not only about the review process, but also the structure and construction of research protocols. So it is a very valuable activity, but it's the requirement that there be this board that's comprised in order to review protocols that are utilizing human subjects. So when we look specifically at the levels of review for institutional review boards, there are 3 levels. And it's important that you understand the distinction between these levels, because one of your tasks in the development of your proposal project will be to determine where in the IRB review process your study would fall, and therefore complete the IRB materials that are required for submission. We will stop short of submission, but you will complete all the materials as if you were going to submit that study for IRB approval. So we will go over the 3 different levels. The first, or the highest level, is what's called full board review. So this is research involving human subjects that requires the formal review by the full IRB committee. So that group of 20 or 25 people that we talked about, that's comprised of scientists and non-scientists and university faculty and researchers and outside people, that is the level of review that's required for a certain level of study. It's required if the research involves greater than minimal risk for the client, for the person participating. So this often includes things such as medical devices or investigational drugs. So this level of review is also required if there is any type of invasive procedure that is utilized or anything that's considered experimental. Then separate from the particular risk involved in the research also is the consideration as to whether or not any of the participants in the study are what is considered to be part of a vulnerable population. So these are people who there perhaps is some concern about their ability to give their own informed consent, or that they might feel, again, coerced or some undue pressure or undue influence to agree to participate in the study when otherwise they may not choose to do so. So this includes people who are incarcerated, so people who are in prison. And we can imagine that there could be perhaps the expectation that if they participate in a particular study, then that might garner them particular favor within the prison setting, or perhaps consideration, or that they also could be at risk for being taken advantage of. People with cognitive impairments are a special consideration when it comes to participating in research, and this becomes a real challenge, especially with research that involves people that you expect perhaps declining cognitive function over the course of the study. So if the study involves people with dementia and the study is expected to go on for several years, then one of the very important considerations is how will their ongoing participation be evaluated and their ongoing consent be evaluated if cognitively it may not be possible for them to continue to give consent. Vulnerable populations also include people who have substance addictions, research that involves HIV or testing for AIDS. And another important category is research involving children. And it depends. Not all research involving children requires full board review, but you almost have to prove the case that it doesn't require full board review in order to go to the next level of review. So children involving research, women who are pregnant, again, may require full board review. It really just depends on the nature of the risk involved with regard to the study. So again, full board review means that it is the highest level of review that's part of the institutional review board, and protocols who are submitted for full board review must go for a formal review of the research plan by the entire committee, who reviews the plan and the benefits and the risks and deems that there is probably more than minimal risk involved in the study, which can be acceptable. We understand that research conveys certain risks, but just that everything has been done in order to protect the subjects, to minimize the risk to the greatest extent possible, to inform them of the risk, and that there is a sound scientific plan behind the study. The next level of review is what we call expedited review. So this is a step under full board review, and the review is by a subcommittee that's typically made up of IRB staff. So expedited reviews include research where there are no invasive techniques that are performed, that all participants are over the age of 18, so they're adults and cognitively able to give their consent. And so this often applies to different types of interventions that we might consider standard of practice, or things that are routinely used in practice. So it might be things in our profession, such as splinting, or different types of intervention, or exercise protocols, or range of motion protocols. Those are all things that we standardly do as part of intervention, so there would be nothing that would be considered so out of the ordinary that it would be deemed experimental. We just might be looking at delivering it a certain way, modifying it a certain way, and we're looking to test the outcome. So with expedited review, you still need informed consent with your participants. You still need to outline everything that we talked about before with regard to full disclosure and risks and benefits of participating. But the distinction between studies that are able to go to expedited review and to full board review is that the expedited studies, again, don't involve invasive techniques. They don't involve what we would consider experimental techniques. Participants do not belong to any of the vulnerable populations we talked about just a moment ago, and all of the participants are adults who are cognitively able to give their consent or withdraw their consent from participation in the study. And finally, the third level of review is what we call exempt review. Now, it's important to understand this doesn't mean it's exempt from review. It means it is exempt from full review. So the submission process is faster for these reviews. Typically, designated IRB staff personnel are the ones who review the protocol and review and approve the study, and they work with a researcher to ensure that the protocol is complete and thorough and everything has been thoroughly addressed. So this may include certain types of record reviews, existing data, different types of surveys. So obviously where there is less than minimal risk for people participating in the study. Oftentimes, some of these studies don't even require contact with a person, although we're using data from people, so that's why it's still covered under review of human research. And the informed consent may actually be a little bit different here because there may not be a requirement for the person to sign something because we may never actually see that person. So, for instance, think perhaps about survey research. So we may send out a link if we're doing an electronic survey, or we might send a sheet of paper if we're doing a mail-out survey that again explains all the things with regard to full disclosure. We need to talk about the purpose of the study, any risks or benefits for them participating in the study, how will we use the data, how will their information be kept confidential, so that they're aware of those things, and therefore their participation in the study is reflected on their willingness to complete the survey. So we don't need anything signed or returned to us. So again, the final level of review is exempt review. It doesn't mean it's exempt from review, it's just exempt from full board review. It still has to be approved by the IRB, and they go through the research plan, ensure that everything is covered, and it applies to very specific types of research where there is definitely less than minimal risk or essentially no risk for participants in the study. So, one of the questions that always comes up is, how do you actually determine the level? So these are the questions that IRB encourages researchers to ask. One, you have to ask, is it research? And that's a very important distinction because it depends on how you collect the data. Are you collecting data? And then how do you intend to use the data? So things that include like quality improvement programs or program evaluation that you're doing for internal processes to better understand perhaps how a process functions, but you have no intention of disseminating that information to a wider audience, then that may not be considered research and actually does not need to go through the IRB process. The other thing you need to ask is, does it involve humans? If it doesn't involve humans, then chances are it does not have to go through the IRB process, or if you're using data from humans, then it will go through a lower level of review for the IRB process. Does the research involve procedures that are part of standard care or standard clinical practice? This is often a big determination as to the difference between full board review and expedited review. Similarly, are the procedures invasive? Are they non-invasive? If they're invasive or if they're outside of standard clinical procedures, then almost guaranteed that study protocol needs to go for full board review. If it's non-invasive and they're standard clinical procedures, then oftentimes exempt review is sufficient. Do the procedures involve more than minimal risk to the participants? If so, then again, you will almost be required to go through full board review. If it's less than minimal risk, then expedited or exempt review may be appropriate. And then finally, are the study participants considered to be part of a vulnerable population? The actual study itself may be minimal risk, but if you're working with one of the groups that are deemed part of vulnerable populations, then that in and of itself may require you to go to full board review. So these are the questions you and your group members will have to ask yourselves as you're determining the level of IRB review needed for your particular protocol that you're developing as part of your proposal project. So when we look actually at the IRB approval process, it's also important to understand that all researchers must complete required training modules. So researchers who are submitting protocols have to show demonstration of completion of ethics training and conflict of interest training. The researcher will need to determine the level of IRB submission, as we just discussed, and they will need to complete the required documentation, which you obtain, like for instance at our institution, from our IRB website. This documentation is lengthy, as you will see and you will experience, but it's important to ensure that all of these areas are addressed as the way to demonstrate the highest level of protection for human subjects that are occurring within research at that institution. So as part of the proposal, some of this you will be able to take directly from your written proposal. It includes information about characteristics of the subjects, how will you recruit the subjects, what is your sampling plan, what are potential risks and benefits of the study, what are things that are being done to minimize the risk, What are procedures that will be in place to manage if something unanticipated happens? How will you be ensuring confidentiality? Is there an external funding source that is helping to support that research? How will data be collected and maintained? And how will you obtain informed consent? What will those procedures be so that the person, again, feels free to consider their participation in the research, to give their consent, or also to withdraw their consent at any point? So the protocol is submitted for approval. It is very important to understand that the study may not begin prior to receiving approval from the IRB office. So you could do things like background work, literature review, working on materials for the study, but you cannot recruit, and you certainly cannot begin any type of data collection or any sort of contact with any potential study participant until you have IRB approval. That is a significant violation of research protocol, and as a researcher, you can be substantially disciplined if you do not follow these procedures. Most studies receive annual approval, so if a study has gone for full board review, they will receive annual approval, and then they need to submit a progress report 1 year later. So the IRB office continues to monitor study as they are in progress. So it's not that you just receive one-time approval and you never have to report back to the IRB. They have a reporting mechanism that all researchers must follow. If something unanticipated happens, or even if it is anticipated but it's an adverse event, this must be reported to the IRB within 24 hours. So if a person sustains some sort of injury as a result of that intervention, if they become ill, if it's some sort of perhaps pharmaceutical study, if they experience any sort of adverse effect, this must be reported to the IRB, and then they will help you navigate that reporting process. So the submission process and the approval process follows along a timeline, but the main takeaway point here is that no study activities may begin prior to receiving IRB approval. Now, let's take a look at how we actually access the protocols and materials that we use to submit a study to the IRB office for review and approval. This will be the URL. You can just go to our homepage and type in IRB in the search, and you will come up on their link, which will take you to their particular landing page for the Office of IRB at our institution. So it's a very helpful site. There's a tremendous amount of resources. I would highly encourage you to spend some time looking at the information here just to help continue to increase your understanding of this important process. But when you are beginning to investigate how you will submit the materials for your particular proposal with your group, you will go to the tab up here on the left that says Submit a Study, where you see the green arrow. That will take you to several options, but one of the things that you can select are what's a new study checklist. And these are checklists for submitting a new study. And this is a very helpful tool because as you determine which level of review you need, you can go to these checklists, and this essentially is a Word document that provides you guidance in how you complete all of the forms. Now, I will caution you, IRB proposals require a substantial amount of forms. There are a multitude of forms, even for exempt research, and it's important that we follow the process for completing the forms correctly and very thoroughly, because without that, the IRB committee or the IRB staff member or the IRB office cannot efficiently go through the protocol and begin to approve your research project or your research plan. So for instance, let's say you determine that your group's proposal is focusing on research that would be classified as expedited. So you go to the expedited submission checklist, and that will take you to one of these forms. So what you have to do is there will be what's called a core application or a common application, and so these will be forms that are required for any study being submitted, and you can see those are the first ones listed there. Then what you have to do is you have to process through the rest of the forms and determine if they are required or not. So for instance, nearly every study will require a Form D, the research consent, so you will go about completing that form. However, Form D1 only applies if you're conducting research at a VA facility or the VA hospital. So if your research proposal has nothing to do with VA participation, then you can just entirely skip Form D1. So part of the process is determining not only what level you need, but then also which forms. So you don't want to complete forms that you don't need, but obviously you have to complete the forms that you do need. Another helpful site that is on the IRB website is this particular sort of grid that helps you think about your particular study. So again, this is under the Submit a Study tab. You can go to Forms and New Studies, and that will take you to this page called New Research Forms. And you can see here from left to right, it's sort of the continuum of IRB office review and approval. So as we said, studies that maybe focus on program evaluation or quality improvement may not actually be considered research, and so you would submit the forms for that. If you were perhaps using leftover data or leftover specimens, then it would be research, but it's not involving human subjects. And then we move over to exempt forms in the green column there. So this would be retrospective chart reviews, surveys of adults, perhaps comparing to existing educational methods. And you can click on the tab down below, and it would take you to all of the forms that are part of exempt protocol submission. And then you can see in the two shades of purple there over to the right, those are both ones that do go through IRB approval. So your expedited forms and your full board forms. So again, this is a very helpful site to kind of continue to familiarize yourself in how do you make the determine of which level of review is needed. So in summary, we've discussed several key aspects of protection of human subjects in research. We discussed the 3 principles of protection, and that's full disclosure, confidentiality, and informed consent, and how these principles really form the basis of everything that we do with regard to IRB approval and IRB review. We've come to understand that all studies must have some sort of oversight when they involve human subjects, and at institutions such as universities, such as the Health Science Center, that's done through what we call an Institutional Review Board or an IRB review. We understand that there are 3 levels of IRB review. We have at the highest level full board review, which means the review goes to the entire committee for review. The next level, we have expedited review, which still requires typically the same amount of documentation, but it's reviewed by a smaller committee as opposed to the full board. And then we have exempt research, which again, not exempt from full board, not exempt from review, it's just exempt from full board review and has to be reviewed by an IRB personnel in order to ensure that the requirements are met and that researchers are doing everything possible to minimize the risk for participants involved, and that they are protecting their human subjects who have agreed to give their time and participation to research efforts.